Right, hello. Thank you so much for coming on today. Could you please state your name, title, and what you do?
My name is Diannely Antigua. I am author of the book Ugly Music. I'm a poet and Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
So could you please tell us a bit about your collection Ugly Music and what it explores?
My collection, Ugly Music, was actually my master's thesis over at NYU, and it explores some pretty taboo topics such as mental illness, sexual abuse, domestic violence, things that normally aren't dinner conversations. I really believe in having candid and frank conversations about these particular topics to raise awareness and to destigmatize them.
I noticed that while reading that you were also awarded a Global Research Initiative Fellowship to Florence, Italy. What did your research entail, and what was it like to travel to Italy as part of your work?
Applying for that fellowship was probably the easiest thing that I've ever had to do in my entire life. I wasn't allowed to write any more than 10 sentences in order to apply for that fellowship through NYU's graduate school. And basically the great thing about that was I was able to go to any of their off-site campuses that were not in New York City. And the one that I was most attracted to was in Florence, Italy. And my project that I proposed while being in Florence was writing sonnets. And being the hopeless romantic that I was at the time, I had been heartbroken. So I decided that all of these sonnets I was going to write were going to be breakup sonnets. So the 3 months that I was there, I wrote 25 breakup sonnets, and some of them will be in my newest collection, A Good Monster, coming out in 2024.
So what does poetry offer you as an artist that other mediums probably, maybe do not?
I think what poetry offers me that maybe other mediums don't is the ability to use my voice and it be my voice alone. Music, for instance, if you're a singer-songwriter, there's always something in the background accompanying you. There's, music, there's instruments. But for me, poetry is just my voice alone. And I grew up in a very religious household and religious system. And my voice wasn't something that I was allowed to exercise as much as I would have liked to, as much as I would have needed to. And poetry and writing especially was a way for me to have my own voice and to exercise that in a way that felt comfortable for me, in a way that, again, other mediums don't really allow or maybe aren't quite as easily accessible in that way.
What is your process of writing poetry like?
With writing, I don't have a particular writing practice at the moment where, I get up at the same time every day and drink my coffee and write. I don't do that. I recommend it for other people, but I don't do it. It's something that, I wait for inspiration to strike me, but it's not the type of inspiration where I'm kind of like floating away and, inspired by the muses, as it were. It's really the mundane things that inspire me. And I keep in my phone just a notes a notes section where I, write things throughout the day that, just kind of catch my eye. I think one of the things about being a poet is that we're really observant. And that's what, keeping those notes in my phone are all about, is just the mundane observations. And if, let's say, for instance, I'm going to talk particularly about one particular poem in my book. It's called Picked. And there was a occurrence that I was, coming home from school one day. I was living in New York, and my stop was Myrtle Ave Broadway on the JMZ. And I noticed a man was stealing fruit at a fruit stand. And I just wrote it down in my phone thinking, oh, this might be in a poem someday. And it wasn't until maybe, a few months later when my semester was starting and we were going to be doing a workshop the next day, and I needed to produce a poem. So I went into my notes and I saw that line, as I watch a man steal fruit on the corner of Myrtle Ave and Broadway. And then I started writing more. The next line says, I want to know what to do with the memory. And that really kind of mundane observation of watching a man steal fruit was the way in which for me to enter into a poem that I had been trying to write for over a decade. And it was a poem about my own abuse when I was younger. And it was just really interesting to think that such a mundane thing could then lead to something so unbelievably profound.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that's just so interesting is being able to just see like everyday things and write it down, and then how that just sort of like comes back to you suddenly, you know what I mean? Like that is just so interesting how this one particular moment you saw in your life, you know, you write it down and then all of a sudden it just becomes the beginning to something that just like, you know, explores, you know, into your past, and then just something, right, exactly like you said, like just something so profound.
Well, that's what our lives are made out of, right? These really small, mundane moments. We brush our teeth, we get up, we maybe see something on TV, maybe someone, you know, cuts us off in traffic, whatever it is, that's what our lives are made out of, these really small moments.
Yeah.
And that's what was helping me enter into this much, much bigger moment.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So how would you characterize the poetry industry, and to get more specific, you know, for a poet now who's looking to get out there, you know, what would the process be like? You know, what's it like now? What's the climate like now for someone who's trying to get out there? Is that
the climate of the poetry industry. Well, I would say it's rather difficult, and at the same time really easy, if that makes any sense. I think you don't decide to be a poet or to write poems because you want to make money. That's the first thing. You write poetry because you love it and you want to write it. It's very different from, let's say, other genres like fiction or nonfiction, where there is, you know, money to be attained. But with poetry, it's much harder to do that. I think a great place to start when it comes to poetry is, you know, literary magazines, especially if you are, let's say, a college student, getting involved in a literary magazine at your particular college or university, which was something that I did here at UMass Lowell. Is, you know, I submitted my work to the Offering and was published there. And then later on, I kind of got into the practice of submitting my poems elsewhere to other literary magazines. And now my work has been, you know, accepted to literary magazines like the American Poetry Review or Washington Square Review. And it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. And it's, at the same time, it's just a click of a button. You know, it's you can be surprised really where your poetry can end up if you just put yourself out there.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the challenges a lot of people face. You know, I can't speak too much to it, but in some of the stuff that I've seen, you know, getting yourself out there and finding ways to get yourself out there, but also kind of convincing yourself to like go and like be, because it's a very vulnerable thing to go and submit poetry or have someone else read it. It's oftentimes, you know, a complete stranger.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, you know,
and if it is a complete stranger and you're writing something that's, let's say, very personal,
yeah,
they don't understand the story necessarily behind the poem. They don't know who you are. So you do have to, you know, convince them with your work that your work is worth publishing. Though I don't feel like we should need to convince other people. I think all of our work is worthy of that, regardless of what it is. But you know, it's poetry biz, as it were. So, yeah.
So, what advice would you have for poets looking to get out there and get published? As a slightly redundant question, but yeah.
Sure. I think it would just be getting into the practice of submitting your work, and learning what, you know, literary magazines at the time are accepting submissions. A lot of them have social media that you can check out, and they often will have calls for submission. You know, on Instagram or Facebook, you can see that information, or getting connected with like writers groups on Facebook, which is something that, you know, people still do. And, you know, just getting the word out is really important. And I think that just getting into that practice of submitting work, even if you do get rejections, that was one thing that I got a lot of at the beginning, and I still do. I used to put all of my rejections in a folder in my my emails. So I would remember, okay, this place, you know, rejected this particular poem. I'm going to beef it up and I'm going to submit it again in a few months. So it was just a way for me to set goals, was to look at all of the rejections that I got, which is, I don't know, maybe masochistic in some ways, but at the same time, like, it was what propelled me forward.
Could you tell us a little bit about your podcast, Bread and Poetry, please?
Sure. So Bread and Poetry is a project that I started as Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I proposed this podcast because I truly believe in making poetry accessible to everyone. It was inspired by a line of poetry by Roque Dalton. The poem is called Like You, and the line says, "I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone." So that's where the idea of Bread and Poetry came from. And, bread is for everyone. Bread is what sustains us. So I want poetry to also sustain people. We need it in order to live. We need bread. We also need poetry. So I want to kind of demystify and make poetry accessible to everyone. I think there's this notion that poetry is something that needs to be decoded. We have to have this key in order to open that door, and everything's a symbol or whatnot. But poetry doesn't need to be that way. And I'm just more interested in what and how poetry makes people feel.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly with poetry, I think also there's this sense that on top of I feel like sometimes this idea that we always have to okay, there's some deeper meaning here and we have to break down every single, you know what I mean? I think that sometimes creates a wall. And I don't know if you necessarily agree with that, but I think that sometimes people are intimidated by that maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
I think that is exactly right and right on the nose. I think it does intimidate people, and that causes people not to engage with poetry or in poetry, whether it's writing it or reading it, because they think it's something that's really difficult to access, difficult to understand. I'm not going to say that there aren't difficult poems. There are, for sure. But I don't think that poetry is necessarily meant to be understood always. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that it is a mystery, and it needs to be, just adored and cherished for its mystery. And I'm more interested in the feeling, the emotion that we get when we experience that mystery.
Yeah. And I think that, just to build on that, I think, speaking personally to my experience, having that thought that, okay, I need to break everything down in poetry, and kind of almost kind of being intimidated by it and losing my confidence a bit. But there was this sort of just liberating feeling when you just read poetry, and you just read it to read it. You just let the emotions come, you let the feelings come, you just experience it, reread it again, same thing, and then, and then maybe if there's something more you're pulling from it, the associations maybe come later.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about communing with the work that we're reading on the page. We're communing with the poet who wrote it, the words, and they're communicating to us as well. So I like the idea that my podcast, is about breaking bread, really. We're, having communion, as it were, with each other. And the podcast is about, poetry, but it is also about bread. We do talk about bread at length. I ask all my guests what their favorite type of bread is, which is actually a very, very difficult question to answer. I'm curious what your favorite type of bread is. And then I also ask them about a beautiful, challenging, or powerful memory that includes bread. And you would be surprised what memories they end up bringing up and how that ends up connecting to our conversation later about poetry. It's an organic conversation. And again, it's just so wonderful to see it unfold in a way where everything connects.
Yeah. Well, the conversation about bread feeds the conversation. Look at that.
Yes.
That's awesome. So, in terms of, I'd like to speak a little bit about your poetry in your collection. So, sure. Your poems, Equinox, It's So Pretty to Drunk Cry on a Subway Platform, and Alabanza, all showcases really just evocative and vivid imagery. And it just creates this clear, just scenes in my head and these emotions tacked on with it. And so when writing, do you kind of find that these image associations, come to you in these images first? Or do you often see maybe words on a page first and then the images come afterwards? You know what I mean? And then do you find yourself, and are you kind of surprised by some of the associations that come?
Yeah, I'm surprised and then I'm not surprised, because the mind is an interesting place, and mind especially is an interesting place. I think as someone who's experienced a lot of trauma in their past, being triggered or making associations that kind of come out of nowhere is really natural, and that's kind of just how my mind works. If I see something or hear something, I immediately can tack on a memory to that, and that's just really easy because that's how my mind has had to work because it's been in survival mode and continues to be in survival mode. So it's really easy for me to access that, which I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is what it is. So I'm not really always surprised where my poems end up. And I'm not really surprised that they end up in very kind of dark places or, as you said, evocative images. I'm not surprised by that. But I think that I'm still interested by it. I'm still curious about why my mind has gone in that direction. That is something that I'll never grow tired of being curious about my work and why I end up making these associations.
Yeah, and would you say it's kind of that curiosity that keeps making you go back to explore and kind of keep writing? Like that curiosity as to like, I don't really know the best way to word this, but you get the general gist of what I'm trying to say, like. Yeah.
Curiosity is, I think, a wonderful word and a wonderful thing to practice. I've been in therapy for 10 years, and one thing that my therapist always reminds me is about being curious about myself, being curious about, let's say, why I might react a certain way, and really truly trying to understand my inner family at work. And that's how I am about my poetry as well, really curious. And that is what causes me to continue to go to the page over and over again, is because my work has not finished. I still have more questions. I'm still curious about, these connections and, these occurrences in my life and how I can paint them and write about them in a different way. So the curiosity never ends, as it shouldn't.
So would you be comfortable speaking a little on your past with the church that you were part of, and how poetry has become an outlet for that?
Sure. As I mentioned previously, I did grow up in a really religious household and in a religious system. I grew up basically about Pentecostal, I'd say, though it was a non-denominational church. I started going to that church when I was about 9 years old and didn't really truly separate myself from it until about 19 years old. And it was a difficult system to live under. There were a lot of living standards. There were clothing standards. Women were only allowed to wear skirts, and they had to be at least past the shin bone. Shirts had to be, past the elbow. No makeup, no piercings, no tattoos, no secular music, abstinence, no touching, people of the opposite sex unless you were, related to them. And we had church 3 times a week, and they preached a, message of perfection. And basically that meant that we should be without sin, which is just a concept that is unfathomable, like to be without sin, and to never basically make a mistake ever in your life. So you can imagine what that did to a young mind. And it was very, very damaging. And as someone who already had some level of mental illness to begin with, especially considering my early childhood, the church just exacerbated all of those, obsessive and intrusive thoughts. It exacerbated the depression and the anxiety in a way that, and it was just caused so much destruction to myself and the people in that church. There was little to no talk about mental illness, and seeking help was not an option. Reading your Bible and praying and worshiping, those are the only options for dealing with mental illness. And as a 16-year-old girl, I remember going to my physical one year, and the doctor asked questions like a good doctor should, do you often feel depressed or anxious? And I answered yes. And I remember him saying that, we'll refer you to a counselor. And I remember being liberated by the idea that that was something that, I could do. And I remember bringing that back to my family and telling them about it, and their immediate shutdown. And they said, absolutely not. no way, that, therapist is just going to, prescribe you medication, or they're going to tell you, things that oppose, things that we're learning in church. So the liberated feeling was gone. And it wasn't until about 22 years old, so a whole 6 years later, that I actually started, therapy. And it was almost to the point where it was too late to some degree. And I was lucky that I, had the strength to finally, put my foot down and be like, this is something that I need. And there's absolutely no question about it. And I'm not going to, have no for an answer. My life literally depends on it. My life literally depends on this. So, yeah, it definitely plays into my poetry. There are a lot of religious imagery, and I make a lot of allusions to biblical stories. And it's something that I can't really, escape from. It's there. And, thinking of associations, like if I see something out in the world, it often reminds me of a Bible story, and it's something that I can't really control. It's just that I spent the formative years of my life being a student of the Bible. In church, we had our Bibles on our laps and a notebook and pen. We took notes. It was like being in a lecture hall, really. And that was a practice that I got used to doing. So I was bringing that same fervor to the poems as well. So they do include a lot of religious images for that reason. And I think that I don't imagine that that'll ever stop being something that I kind of weave in and out of. It's just something that's ingrained, for better or for worse, I'm not sure, but it's again how my mind just decides to work and make connections.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, being able to find the strength later in your life to go and do this thing, to go into therapy and kind of put your foot down, that it takes a lot. I'm not trying to speak to it, but it's certainly just something that's pretty incredible. And yeah. In a lot of your poems also, I noticed that, for example, in Diary Entry 4, Ghazal, there's a lot of repetition. And specifically, there's repetition of the word God at the end of each stanza, and it kind of starts to take on this new connotation. And so, building to kind of like that point of kind of, oh man, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking.
That's okay.
I'm trying to keep going because the cameras are rolling, but I'm losing my thoughts. I'll just read off the paper for now, and then hopefully we'll come back to it. So can you tell us a little bit about the use of repetition in the piece? And do you find yourself relying on repetition and other literary mechanisms in your toolbox, such as, alliteration, allusion, etc.?
Sure. So Diary Entry number 4, Ghazal or Huzzle, depending on however you want to pronounce it, it's a particular poetic form that includes repetition as part of the form in itself. But the diary entry forms in general that I've decided to come up with are actually collage poems. So I've written in 36 journals. I've filled in 36 journals over the years since I started writing when I was 9. And one thing that I've started to do is write collage poems based off of each of these journals. So what I'll do is collect language. Let's say, for instance, for this one, it was the 4th journal. I like to number them all because, again, obsessive tendencies, so they're all numbered. So diary number 4, I collected different sentences and phrases and images and wrote them down on a piece of paper. And from that language that I collected, I wrote this poem. And I was noticing while I was collecting this language that within the journal itself, I was repeating the word God a lot, and in different forms, like godly, and it was just a way for me to represent that my own obsession within that journal through that poem. And as you mentioned, the form does change. One of the couplets ends with the word God, another with Godspell or godly or goddess. And again, it was just a way for me to explore this obsession that I had when I was so young with God. And, that poem also talks about my obsession with trying to find help as well. And so it's a really interesting way to weave in this obsession with God and my spirituality with also this cry for help. So it's both at the same time.
Would you be down to read some of your poetry today?
Yeah. I guess what poem makes sense to read? Did you want me to do Self-Portrait as Nostalgia? Is that
Sure.
That one?
You can start with that
works. Okay. And also I'll be happy to read like any of the ones that you mentioned too within the interview. Okay. Self-Portrait as Nostalgia. Something with a girl and a boy, or a father and daughter. Maybe they went for ice cream and one of them never came back. Maybe he did come back. Maybe he kissed her on the mouth, the boy or the father. It doesn't matter. We can mourn things that weren't meant for us. I can tell a lie. I can tell a lie about the pigeons and their beaks. I can say they never ate from my hand, that I never threw rice in the gray sky of the projects, that the sky didn't taste like a manna I couldn't name. But I'm searching for a God and the piano. I'm searching for a God in the belly of a bird. I'm searching for food to miss or to share. Tell me why the birds never come back hungry. Tell me where they've gone. Whose hand feeds them when I'm away? Whose hand feeds them while I sit in this office pretending not to have feelings about a thing? Whose hand said yes to a body without sound? Let me pray on the tongue of a stranger. Let me live a death I don't own. I want to save the girl. I want to save the boy. I want rain on this. I want a fort made out of sheets that still smell like mothballs. If I could drink a life, give me a sip of it. Kool-Aid and gin. If I could imagine a childhood without him, I would. The boy or the father, it doesn't matter.
So would you also be willing to read some of the other poems from that I mentioned in the interview?
Yeah.
Would you like to read Equinox?
I was just about to say that. I was about to say Equinox. Since we're actually coming up, the equinox just passed.
Yes, it did.
Yes. Yeah, so happy spring. With this very sad poem. Equinox. The next spring, I said no. I said no to the melting snow, the pile making streams in the grocery store parking lot. I said no to the sparrow at the bird feeder, no to its beak, the small seed it held, no to the hem of my yellow skirt, the one my grandmother could have sewed, thread dangling down my thigh. Then I said no to the sight of green, the grass covered in winter's salt, the still wet lettuce on a plate, the static glow in the corners of the TV. But I didn't know what to say as I watched the praying mantis feeding the eggs inside her, their father's head. That's my happy spring poem.
Happy spring.
Happy spring, yes. There was another one that you mentioned.
Yeah, the other one, so the one next to it, It's So Pretty to Drunk Cry on a Subway
Ooh,
Platform.
yes. I love this one. So at the end of this poem, there is a line of Spanish, and it's part of the Lord's Prayer. It's so pretty to drunk cry on a subway platform about an ex's dying uncle you didn't know, or about not finding the right mask for the party, the pull of wine on your brows underneath the plastic face. Somewhere in this city, there is a metal swamp. There is a pink dress spotted with black. There is a toad throat ballooning from inside taffeta and tulle. She is the best you'll ever look. Reflection passing with the blur of subway cars, salt biting your face. It's the itch that stays. And you want to be good. Give the stranger something when he asks, but you only have May and the people dead in it. Do you know what it is to hate a season? When things sprout and you want to dig. There's an urban garden looking for volunteers. You sign up when a man with dirty hands offers you strawberries. In Spanish, the word for strawberry is one letter off from fresh. In Spanish, a mother sings to her mother a song to help enter the end. In Spanish, you recite a prayer you learned as a child. Padre nuestro, que estás en el cielo. And in no particular tongue, the train horn responds. Any more that I should read, you think?
Would you be reading to read Alabanza?
Yeah. Righty. So alabanza is a Spanish word that means praise. Alabanza. Praise the beans, the white, the red, the pink, or lentils over rice, guandules, the pigeon peas of my youth. Praise the Kool-Aid, the red lips I kissed her cheek with. My grandmother, Mama we called her, like the Eve for us all, mother of a tiny nation and the projects. Praise her hands flooded and the spirit of other things. Dishwater, bath water, kiddie pool water, rainwater, her grip on the shopping cart on the walk home. Or when she returned it after unloading the groceries, hand that stole from no one. Veins like blue and green vines reaching the flower of her name. Rosa, Rosa. Praise. The secret things touched. The 3 belly button stitch of C-section scars, babies lost on an island I'd never seen. Then the powder she poured and clapped onto her breasts, lifted them, the air like falling sugar I'd stick out my tongue to taste. Then praise the death song. Nursing home bed propped, her body the center of the last altar. And my own mother, positioning her stiff hands over a Bible, picture of a sacred sleep. Praise the cloth she then tied around my grandmother's head to keep her jaw in place. Praise the porcelain dolls, left sleeping in the bottom left drawer of her dresser, the one with the red curls, my favorite. Praise they're waiting for her hand to brush their hair, for her to sing, Alabaré, alabaré, alabaré a mi Señor. Thank you.
So I'd like to open up maybe to the crowd. Does anyone have any particular questions that they would like to ask?
Can you hear me? Am I like loud enough? If there was something, whether it was poetry related or just in general, something you wish you could tell your younger self?
Would you mind just repeating the question?
Sure. So the question was, what do I wish I could have told my younger self? Is that correct? I guess I would say, I'm like thinking about this because whatever it is that I come up with could have changed the trajectory of my entire childhood, you know, so I'm like, oh, this is a lot of pressure. But I think maybe it would have just been like, hold on. I think that might have just been it. Just hold on. You know, this is difficult for anyone, not just, you know, for me in this position, but it would have been for anyone who was experiencing something, you know, similar to what I went through. And I think what I needed was just encouragement to continue, encouragement to keep living each day, knowing that the future would look different. And I think that I didn't have hope for a different future for myself. So I think I really would have benefited from someone telling me to just hold on. Things will be different.
It might sound like a weird question, but it's genuine. In a lot of your poems, you mentioned Kool-Aid, which is very interesting. Is that some sort of motif? I wasn't expecting to hear you talk a lot about Kool-Aid.
Sure. So you're saying in my poetry I mentioned Kool-Aid a lot, and you're wondering if that's a particular motif of sorts. No, I just drank a lot of Kool-Aid when I was a kid. That's really just it. There was a neighborhood kid who used to call me Kool-Aid face, because anytime he saw me, I just had like a rim of red around my lips because I was just constantly drinking red Kool-Aid. So it's just something that I use to represent my childhood. And yeah, I wish it were something more interesting, but it's not. Just about my childhood and all the Kool-Aid I drank.
Very interesting.
Kool-Aid is a very good drink.
I haven't had Kool-Aid in a really long time, and reading these poems that do include Kool-Aid, I'm thirsting for it.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie, like I want some Kool-Aid.
Is there a moment you can remember where you realized you wanted to be a writer and realized you wanted to tell your own personal story?
So is there a moment where I realized I wanted to be a writer and wanted to tell my own story? Well, I started writing in a diary or in journals when I was 9 years old. My oldest sister, she used to write herself, and she gifted me and my other sister diaries for Christmas one year. And it was like the really cheap diary with that lock that you could probably pick with a bobby pin. But I just thought like, oh, this is my place to, you know, tell all my secrets. You know, this is a way for me to really express myself. And I just ran with it. And it wasn't until, though, I was a little bit older and I started reading, you know, diaries and journals of people who I really admired. One of them being Sylvia Plath, and then the other being Anne Frank. And I think reading Anne Frank's diary in particular and seeing how her words changed the world, I wanted my words to mean something and to have an impact. Granted, they would never have the same impact, understandably so, but I wanted my words to mean something to more than just myself. So I became very obsessive about writing all of the details of my life, writing what I ate that day and who I talked to, and if my crush looked at me one time, I had to write about it, much like what Anne Frank did in her diaries as well. So I felt compelled to tell my story in that way in hopes that it would mean something to other people. at some point.
Sorry.
If you feel comfortable answering, I'm curious, like, how, after you left the church, like, how did you navigate, if you did, like, your relationships with people who were, like, still in the church, and, like, was that difficult?
Yeah. So when I left the church, how did I navigate relationships with those who were still in that church? So out of my family, I was the first one to leave the church. None of us are in that church now, so I will preface it with that. But at the time when I left, I was the first one, and that was really difficult and, caused a lot of strain on those familiar relationships. My siblings were, constantly asking me to, come back to church, or, why don't I come to the service this week, or, and there was a lot of pressure to do those things. And I really, again, had to think about what it was that I needed, and what it was that, how I wanted to mold my life and what was important to me. And I knew that going back to that place and entering that building was just going to be so damaging to me. So I had to make a choice, and it wasn't the easiest choice, and it definitely made those relationships difficult. And, my lifestyle choices were very different from theirs, especially when it came to romantic relationships. Two of my older siblings met their significant others and now their spouses in church, and there was a particular dating order and a way to go about courting, because you didn't just date, you courted to marry. So then when I left the church and, was entering the dating scene, that was something that was foreign to them. They didn't understand, the idea of going on dates and meeting new people, and it potentially not leading to marriage, and it potentially just being a relationship, just one in which we, go through and we learn from. Our lives are made up of them entirely, and that was also something for me to learn as well. Navigating relationships in the real world, which was very difficult. I also had to understand that if, someone kissed me, that did not mean that they wanted to marry me, as sad as that was. And it was something that I had to learn, and was at times very, very painful, but it was necessary, and it just has led me to be a much stronger person these days, for sure. That was a great question,
though. No one else has any questions?
There's one back there.
Oh, wait, there is one? I'm sorry. I can hardly see. But,
so you mentioned, no secular music when you were part of the church.
Yeah.
And now that you're out of that, how did you navigate, finding out what sort of music you were into, and do you have any particular influences that have worked their way into your own works?
Sure. So your question is related to the fact that I couldn't listen to secular music while I was in the church, and if now, what type of music I'm drawn to, and how I've navigated learning about music, and if it comes into my poetry. So yeah, that's a big one, and it's one of those things where even just having a normal conversation with, anyone, talking to friends, and they're like, oh, have you heard that song? Or, if they're playing something on the radio, and I'm like, I have never heard this song before. And that happens more often than I would like. And especially, people are like, are you serious? Like, you don't know this song? Like, everybody knows this song. And then I kind of have to explain my upbringing. There's just no way for me to not. I can't really talk about any aspect of my life without talking about the church. So that definitely is something that I've had to navigate and learn about. And before I started going to the church, the last CD that I had bought was the Millennium CD, the Backstreet Boys CD, which I loved to pieces. I loved the Backstreet Boys so much. And then when I left the church, and started listening to secular music again, I had to come to the realization that the Backstreet Boys weren't as cool as, you know, I had thought they were. And that NSYNC, you know, the other boy band, that Justin Timberlake had gone solo, which was just, I couldn't believe it. I was like, what in the world? But I have a lot to learn, and I'm constantly having to play catch up. But what I have really loved and what's really, I think, influenced my poetry is, you know, Amy Winehouse. And I really love her work a lot. And that kind of just style, Billie Holiday and Billie Eilish, my two Billies, as I call it. They're both kind of sad in their own right. So those three, I think, are like the pillars in my music catalog. But then even just thinking culturally, just being Dominican, you know, just listening to more merengue and bachata and salsa and reggaeton, that's something that I just can't get enough of. So that's definitely in my Spotify playlist for sure these days.
No one has a hand up, right? Like
You can ask me any question. I'll answer it. I don't care. I am an open book, actually, very much so.
out there. Oh,
Yeah.
What's your favorite kind of bread?
What's my favorite kind of bread? A lot of people have asked me this question, and I almost don't want to even talk about my favorite kind of bread is, because my hope is that at some point I'll have another poet interview me on my own podcast and ask me all of the probing questions that I ask all of my guests. But it's really hard to pick just one. But I think one of my favorites is sourdough bread. It's just, I love the tanginess of it. It's so simple too. There's nothing, you know, fancy about it. It's just sourdough bread, and it can really just change the whole like flavor profile of a sandwich, let's say, or just even, you know, sourdough toast with butter. Like that to me is such a luxury, as simple as it is.
yeah, I was thinking garlic bread the whole time. But sourdough is really good.
Yeah. I'm a simple gal. I
Yeah.
like simple things, for sure. What's your favorite kind of bread? Is it garlic bread?
It's garlic bread and sourdough bread, I'd say.
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat.
Nice.
Mostly garlic bread leaning, but nobody else has any questions left. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, for interviewing me. I really appreciate having this conversation with you today. That means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.